You mentioned in the research a lack of literature on destructive leadership in education. Why do you think this is, and is it surprising that this has perhaps been overlooked?
Well, I think it is because we have a perception in education that, or a tendency to see it as a feel-good kind of environment. So, and that's important that we do, that we see it as a caring, nurturing environment where children are looked after and adults are able to professionally flourish. However, as a consequence of, I guess, wanting to emphasise the positive and be optimistic, we've perhaps neglected the reality of the negative. And by doing that, we're neglecting the opportunity to address it.
You note that one of the outcomes of destructive leadership is that it causes harm to people, organisations and the immediate environment in a ripple effect. Are there any unique manifestations of this in the education environment?
Well, I guess one of the things in the education environment is that people feel trapped in it. So if you have an environment that is dysfunctional in some way, often in other environments people feel that they can get out or escape it in some way. But I guess the school environment, people tend to, if they pass the first 5 years, for example, they tend to stay in that kind of profession. So maybe it's a sense of entrapment almost that means that that's something different about the education environment. I think the critical thing about the education environment is because it's intentionally nurturing of children, it's probably a more dramatic consequence.
Your analysis mentions research suggesting that subordinates play their part in enabling the existence of destructive leadership. In practice, what are some of the things that educators can do to mitigate or overcome destructive leadership in their work environment?
Well, I guess what we found in the research is that it's operating, when you have a destructive environment, it's operating at several different levels. So the micro level, the meso middle level and the macro level. And so the action needs to address all of those levels. So what can people personally do to look after themselves physically, emotionally, to reaffirm their values, really importantly, and so that they can feel strong in those kind of climates. And then at the group level, it's about how do we enable high-performing teams and empower high-performing teams, and people have autonomy and trust is operating amongst people. So at that middle level, I think it's about reinforcing team norms and establishing what those are and being very clear about those and a shared language around those. And then, of course, at the macro level, at the organisational level, what policies are in place, what strategies are in place to mitigate should that happen, to prevent in the first place and to address in the second if it actually happens.
Given the hierarchical nature of educational institutions, is it to some extent inevitable that destructive leadership will take place?
I think it's certainly a potential emergent quality of a hierarchical structure, yes, because you have got those layers of people, power relationships, typical in schools, and often more broadly in systems as well. Our research wasn't about any one system, it went across education systems. But all systems are typically in education organised hierarchically. And so that then does lend itself to asymmetrical power relationships. And a consequence of that can be, if you've got wrong personalities in place, if you haven't got established values, a culture developing. And I guess it's that normative cultural development that ultimately leads to destructive leadership, yeah.
Do you think much can be done to traditional organisational structures to change things?
Well, absolutely. I think we can a whole range of things in the organisations themselves, where we have professional learning for leaders who understand that leadership is an outcome rather than them as leaders being the boss and therefore being hierarchical and powerful in how they operate. So I think we can look at flatter structures in organisations. We can certainly look at greater voice. I mean, it's what we teach in schools, voice and agency, how you empower students to have that. So in organisations, people understanding that with position it's not privilege. So establishing those norms, policies, strategies within an organisation, and having effective ways that people can challenge the cultural norm should it become in some way dysfunctional or threatened. So I think we can look at different structures. I think there are different structures that exist in organisations. But if we are really truly about children, breeding children who understand their rights and have voice and are able to articulate those, then we need to be looking at how we run our schools similarly, so that they're not seeing the model around them of powerful people yelling or being all pervasive. Yeah.
Are you aware of any steps being taken in education to try and limit instances of destructive leadership in education, or at least minimise their impact?
Well, I think policies exist in education in different organisations, and I think there's probably greater understanding about the relational side of leadership than perhaps there was in the past, and the importance of trust and so on. But I think the fact that it's under-researched would indicate that there's not enough recognition that it's actually happening. And whenever I talk about the research, even if it's over dinner with someone, immediately people will recognise and have a story to tell. It may not be their own, maybe someone else's. So whilst I think there are things like anti-discrimination, anti-bullying, confidentiality policies and so on, in reality it continues to exist, and I think early action is frequently not taken by those who could take it.